you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Welcome to Visiting the Village. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor and I'm joined as ever by the indefatigable Ian Hardingham.
Hello Mr. Paul Taylor. You didn't know this until now, but I actually sold all of our secrets to the Chinese 10 years ago. I didn't get very much money for it, so that's why I'm still here talking to you.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
Samuel Roberts wonders if he maybe takes Rocket League a little too seriously. In a piece for PC Gamer, he writes about how focusing on winning has turned him into, quote, a dick, close quote. Ian Hardingham, what do you think about the balance between competitiveness and fun in online games?
I don't know that it's really a choice. I exhibit all of the same things that this guy talks about, basically getting angry when he loses, being rude to other people that he's playing with online, and generally having a much higher blood pressure for playing this game. I experience all of that with Rocket League. It's quite upsetting, but I don't know how I would change it.
Yeah, I think it's an inevitable part of any kind of competitive activity, right? I mean, all of these behaviours happen if you're playing tennis casually with other people and you don't like your doubles partner. You're going to get angry with them. That's just natural. I think some people treat these things slightly differently. I tend to get very angry with myself and my opponent in one-on-one games, but in team games, I don't kind of really worry about my partners that much, especially in a casual game. Like, I kind of think with Rocket League, unless you're a really organised, serious team, you've got to kind of ignore what your partners are doing.
Yeah, I care about doing well, certainly in this game. I don't generally like playing games that I'm not good at. I'm definitely one of those people. And I get pretty annoyed when I'm doing badly, and I just don't know how I would turn that off. I mean, I guess there are a lot of nice people who just like playing games and don't mind if they win or not. I guess a lot of those people play board games and just like it as a social experience. But that's such an alien concept to me that I don't really know how to respond to this guy saying he'd like to change.
Yeah, I really take... Rocket League's so interesting because it's so much on the cusp of like this kind of knockabout thing that you can do for fun, certainly in the early days, and we talked about this a bit when the servers were new and everyone was having a good time and they were gambling through the green and beautiful pastures of gameplay. And now it's all got a bit serious, and I kind of... With a lot of these games, when you start to advance a skill level a bit, you get into kind of the dark phase where everyone's not very good, but they're all trying to be good, and that's kind of the least fun part of multiplayer gaming for me.
Yeah, there's this really interesting graph of sort of how much you enjoy a sport or a game and how good you perceive yourself to be as you progress. I think there's this sort of constant pressure that as you start getting better and you get really good feedback, you start to expect more and more from yourself until your expectations get way above your standards. You have like a big meltdown, you stop enjoying it for a while, you go away from the game, maybe you take a little bit of time off, you lower those expectations and you come back, and it's not that you've got better or that you're actually fresh to the game, but because your expectations have gone down, you're enjoying it again. So there's this real sort of curve of how your expectations change as you play. And it's such a weird thing. It's just part of the horrors of being a human and sort of getting better at things and dealing with change and just thinking like, yes, right now I am the best player of Game X in the entire world, and then the next second realising that's completely false. That's quite a tough thing to get through, but I know that professional sportsmen do. A lot of sort of middling tennis players need to take a few months off and they come back feeling refreshed and have got their drive back. And I think that it's all about sort of internal expectations.
Right, expectations can be very bad in multiplayer games, and I think this ties into the whole kind of conscious competence, unconscious competence thing, where you know what you're supposed to do, but you can't execute it, and your play gets worse because you're spending a lot of time thinking about what you should be doing and not be able to reach that. I mean, certainly fighting games have that problem where they're very execution-based at pretty much all levels, and if you get into a fighting game and you start watching videos and you start watching pro matches, you can pick up the metagame quite quickly, and you know that you should be doing like a reverse throw at a specific time, but that thing might be really hard to execute, so you basically just get angry. And I don't think that there's any way you can escape that from game design. As you're saying, it's kind of a universal thing, and it applies a lot specifically to these games where you can have a lot of knowledge without having a lot of skill.
I think this really feeds into some concerns I have that I think we voiced last week about the bronze, silver, gold, diamond league system, which has become incredibly popular now. I believe that Blizzard started it off with StarCraft 2, Rocket League does it, a lot of other games have copied it. It seems like the point of this league system is that you're always winning at about 50%. As soon as you're winning at more than 50%, you get bumped up to be with better people. As soon as you're winning less, you get bumped down. And I'm just trying to work out how I feel about that. As a guy who likes to do well and compete well, that seems like a frustrating thing to me. I know that I'm never going to be the best player in the world, and it feels like I'm never ever going to get to a point where I'm winning a lot of my matches. I like team games like Tribes 2 and to a certain extent 3-on-3 in Rocket League, where at least I can take on a role and consistently succeed in that individual role. If you're defending, if you're doing a role that a lot of people don't like to do, then you can actually be really good in that role and have like consistent success. But a lot of people, I think, don't mind sort of playing in a more fun way and don't mind losing. And it feels like those are the guys that should be matched up with people like me.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, the league structure thing I think is good because it provides you with a generalized way of describing and understanding your skill level. And in a lot of these games, what you want is some really vague marker of like how good you are in the world. And they do provide that, albeit in a very sketchy, not very accurate way. And I think also with the team aspect of these games, there are problems with certain games, for example, MOBAs, where it is impossible to have fun if one or more of your team members are terrible. Like, it makes the game not fun. In Rocket League, if you have a 3-man team and one of them is absolute garbage, it can be really interesting trying to work around that person. Or even if you are that person, if you occasionally contribute anything to the match and your teammates are nice and they praise you, that's a really fun and interesting situation. So I think one thing with game design in the future, it would be nice to look past these very codified roles in team games and allow more flexibility in terms of variable skill levels.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's move on.
Metanet Software, developers of action platformers N and N+, were frustrated by the lack of press attention their new game, N++, got during the critical launch period. There was a big thread on NeoGAF about this. Ian, is this generally meaningful, or did the N++ games just make a mistake?
Well, I think it's generally meaningful. To précis, or just to summarise the post, they expected to get a lot of sort of default press coverage because A, the game is very good, apparently, according to them, and B, their previous games have such a lot of fans that they expected that to make it newsworthy on its own. I think that both you and I would say that this is the new era of indie games where you don't get news coverage on its own unless you're doing something very new and exciting, and I think almost by definition N++ is not doing something particularly new. It's a iteration, a polishment of what they've been doing in the past. So I'm definitely not surprised they've had this. We had a little bit of difficulty getting as many reviews for Frozen Cortex as we wanted, and that was despite having the legendary Paul Gilduff-Taylor on the case. It's just a lot harder now. In terms of them saying that they didn't have time to market the game before release because they were too busy finishing the game, I feel that that's something that you want to talk a lot about in terms of prioritizing your life as an indie developer.
Right, this is an interesting one. I mean, I think N and N+ are very much of their time. They were certainly kind of very interesting indie games in that what I'm going to call the 2005 to 2008 window, when a lot of indie developers were really testing the boundaries of what you could do. So these kind of interesting, very pared down minimal platformers were really cool in that time, especially when you were seeing a lot of these sort of flowery, overly artsy, not very mechanics driven platformers.
Yes,
so
just to butt in,
sure.
To describe to some of the listeners who may not be familiar with these games, as far as I am aware, these games are a little bit like a minimalist version of Super Meat Boy. They're very hard, they're about sort of redoing a level over and over again, and they're very minimalist.
Right, yeah, that's exactly right. So to point that out is good because they were specifically a contrast to what was happening at the time. So expecting that a sequel will automatically do well now, even though they've already had a successful sequel in N+, is possibly a mistake. I mean, the other thing, which I'll come onto in a bit, is we've seen Trine 3 this week, a huge budget 3D reimagining of the Trine franchise not do very well at all. So we're in this difficult time for indie sequels. I think with this, it's a difficult prospect to start with, right? Trying to market a game like that. I really strongly believe that indie game marketing now is about compounding the existing success of your concept. So if the concept is working well, the marketing's going to allow it to reach out further and reach more people. It's not going to save an uninteresting concept, and it's not going to make a mediocre game sell well. So I don't think that that's a massive problem here, but then subsequently saying, oh, we didn't get reviews in time, it seems like if you don't try to do something and you don't achieve it, then you don't really have much to complain about.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with all of that. I think that the bottom has fallen out of this particular kind of platformer. That's definitely my casual view on this as well. It must be difficult when the third game in your series is the one that isn't successful. I hadn't actually heard that about Trine 3. Maybe we'll get to talk about that later. That's very interesting. I think that it must be just very, very disturbing. You would obviously expect if the first two games do really well, that the third would do really well as well.
Well, Trine 3 was super interesting because apparently it's both. Trine is a very beautiful platform game, exploration platform game, and Trine 3 they moved it into 3D. So I haven't actually seen footage of the game, but I've just read about what people have said. They changed the entire kind of paradigm of the game to try and sort of make the sequel more interesting, to use the brand to go forward. So lots of kind of supposedly sensible stuff there, but taking a game from 2D to 3D is always going to be massively problematic.
Oh, interesting. Right. Yeah, I had forgotten, but that is true. They did make it 3D, and I could imagine that turning off a huge number of people. I don't particularly want my favourite 2D platformer to go 3D, so that might be a massive misstep as well. We should try and bring that up maybe on next week's podcast with a bit more analysis and try and work out what's going on there.
Sure. Chloe Rad wrote about revisiting abandoned virtual worlds in a piece for Killscreen a while back, inspired by a piece on Second Life by Patrick Hogan. She describes how going back to a 2D chat program she used to use as a youth now feels eerie due to a lack of users and absurd compared to what we currently use. Do you find these abandoned spaces in virtual worlds evocative, Ian Hardingham?
I do. I'm always struck by how much like science fiction our world has become. The idea of abandoned virtual spaces is something that's very much used in a lot of authors' science fiction as a meeting place for main characters, or somewhere for a main character to go to reflect on his life. And somehow that's exactly what it's turned out to be. In this day and age where we don't have to throw away virtual things because they don't really use up any physical space and they don't cost very much to maintain, being able to see these artifacts of a decade ago, they feel as old as things in real life from 200 years ago. Everything moves so much faster now, and it's definitely eerie, and it probably is also very nostalgic. If you spent a massive proportion of your time communicating with other people in a game like Second Life or in this chat program, then you're going to have all of these feelings associated with that. Whenever I go back to, I will sometimes wander around an empty Tribes 2 level just to kind of get that nostalgic feeling, the echoes of the past. So yeah, this is the new sort of looking back at your old diary or notebooks, I think.
Just to go sort of full masturbatory for a second, I think we're in the era of a new understanding of what virtual space is and what it means to people. So I would say the walking simulator genre and the rise of VR and all of this stuff, we now have old virtual spaces that feel different. If you go and play Doom now or Wolfenstein, they have a different quality to modern virtual spaces. So I think we're starting to understand culturally and psychologically how we relate to these imaginary environments. And the idea of abandoned social spaces is really interesting, like the video and pictures you see of abandoned theme parks and stuff like that. Things that are designed to be used actively but are empty, I think are really interesting.
These MMOs, going back to look at Asheron's Call or World of Warcraft even, in the far-flung future where no one plays World of Warcraft anymore. They're such massive games. They're absolutely huge. They've had like over a decade of content being added to them, and they're already, by the nature of the genre, requiring of being a huge world. It can be just a truly crazy thing to move around in. One of the things that's disappointing about MMOs at the moment and so far has been that they still feel a little linear to me, mainly due to the leveling and the grind. And that makes it sort of less cool to explore just as a tourist. Like, tourism in these games isn't as cool as it should be.
I was just going to say that my business idea is to go to Second Life and do tours of all the cool abandoned places that you can go to show people kind of the weirdness that exists there. I think that would be a good plan. And yeah, I mean, WoW was very much about making the MMO more linear, effectively. I think it was about kind of bringing all of the cool experiences together. It was the Valve of MMOs versus the Warren Spector of MMOs. It was trying to make the roller coaster for you. So yeah, I think that undermines the idea of these open, free spaces. But I think we want to kind of preserve these places, even if these games don't exist anymore. It would be terrible if all of these actual locations died out alongside the game.
Yeah, it feels like this is like a new kind of Let's Play, sort of tourism of these old spaces. And I can't wait to be the first customer on your Second Life penis tours.
Does the gameplay in Shadow of the Colossus get short shrift? According to Hamish Todd in an article for Kotaku, the game gets lots of deserved praise for art direction and story, but relatively little attention is given to the gameplay and level design. In the article, he goes on to praise and analyse one Colossus in particular, the giant bird Avion. What do you think about the relationship between notable art in games and notable design?
Yeah, so this is interesting. This article starts off by saying, if Shadow of the Colossus's core gameplay was quick time events, no one would like it, no matter how great the surrounding world and storytelling and atmosphere is. He says that as a way of trying to underline the fact that people only talk about how wonderfully atmospheric Shadow of the Colossus is, and rarely talk about the fact the gameplay is good as well. But he's absolutely right. If the gameplay wasn't at least pretty good, it would not be anywhere near as much of a fondly remembered game. It's true in the case of Shadow of the Colossus, but I kind of struggle to think of that many other games that people spend so long talking about that kind of stuff that they gloss over the gameplay. Even with something like Deus Ex or Thief, I think people have always in their minds the mechanics of those games.
I think the one for me here is Uncharted, where people really talk a lot about the story and about how it looks, but the gameplay is moronically bad in those games. I mean, I really genuinely struggle to see how anyone can enjoy that gameplay. It's one level above QuickTime events. And so for me, I think there is this situation where the story and art can really convince people that the design is good when it isn't.
Yeah, he actually brings up Uncharted in this article as almost the counterpoint, that it's to a slightly different point, which is that Shadow of the Colossus is using a lot of open world and rich systems to produce the kind of events dynamically that games like Uncharted try so hard to fully script for you. And if we pivot into talking about that for a minute, he talks about this giant bird and basically how speed running this giant bird shows that players use physics to do unexpected things, and that great game design involves having a system that's rich enough that it can be abused, basically, and comparing that to exactly the kind of bad design that you're talking about. And that's completely right, and that's one of the wonders of physics, and physics is one of the most obvious examples because it is a sort of 3D space to explore. There's no way that the designers can work out everything that you could possibly do. They just set the rules and then see what happens. And that is an amazing part of gaming, to be able to explore these new systems. And when you combine it with something as richly drawn as Shadow of the Colossus, you get something truly great. Just reading this, just made me want to go back and play Shadow of the Colossus again, because it is truly great.
Yeah, having a comprehensible system that the player can experiment with is such a huge part of design in so many games. And I think the problem is that in a lot of certainly top-selling games, players aren't really interested in that. That a lot of players want to have a straightforward linear experience where their actions have a cool result, and it doesn't matter to them whether their actions are scripted or dynamically generated, as long as they feel on some level like some agency for it. So I think that's always the tension with design, is trying to do that thing which can have the highest possible return, which is making an amazing system, in the context of that really not being important to whether a game succeeds or not.
Yeah, I agree.
The website Road to VR put out a rebuttal to what they believe to be the 3 most common arguments against VR. According to the author Ben Lang, the arguments are: VR has already failed, 3D TV failed and VR is 3D, so it too will fail, and the Kinect failed because gamers don't find gesture input compelling and they don't have room. VR will have the same problem. Ian Hardingham, are these actually the most common arguments against VR, or do we have a bit of a straw man situation going on here?
I don't think 3D TV has failed. VR is 3D, so it will fail too is one of the most common arguments, although it did make me laugh a lot when I read it. In terms of virtual reality has already failed, I think that definitely is the number one existing argument against it, and it's one that I also find reasonably compelling. It's not that it's an impossibility that VR will succeed now, because it has failed more than once in the past, but it's definitely a real data point that has to be taken into account, and it forces people to talk about the way things are different. I know that VR headsets are a lot smaller now and a lot higher quality, and everything around it has got better, and I think that that could mean that VR succeeds now, but there are, I think, some fundamental problems. I'd love to use Kinect failing as an excuse for anything I want to persuade happening. I don't think gamers do particularly like gesture input, and I do not think gesture input has to be a massive part of VR.
Also, I think this is one of those kind of revisionist history things about Kinect again, because Kinect was the best-selling games peripheral of all time. And people do tend to forget that, just because Kinect games stopped happening. The Kinect was actually a massive success, I think, by pretty much every metric. So it is very interesting that the game industry does not like these novelty things. We tend to... I think the only reason why people still speak of the Wii favourably was because the Wii was such an overwhelming commercial success that almost nobody could possibly put that in a cupboard and say, oh, it wasn't a real success, because people don't make Wii games.
Well, I think you've got the right point, which is that the Wii is pretty much the only one of these that people actually remember fondly. I think it's because it was such a success that so many games were released for it that there was quite a lot of interesting, smaller, non-commercial games. That's definitely why I remember the Wii fondly. It actually was an exciting new console, and I think for that to be true, it has to kind of get to a certain level of success. Most of these things don't. You're right about Kinect not failing. I would love to fail in the same way that Kinect does in most things that I do. Of course, all of these things are originally marketed as being the thing that changes your life forever. So yes, the Kinect failed in those terms, but in terms of a way of getting people talking about the Xbox, buying the Xbox, and I've been to several non-gamer family houses who have the Kinect and really like it, especially for younger children. And I don't really think it's got anything to do with VR. And if the Kinect had done amazingly well, I wouldn't have thought that would imply that VR would do amazingly well either. In terms of the global argument, I still am on the fence, leaning towards falling off in the VR is not quite ready yet camp. I don't know if it's got like another... I don't think we've got like another 15 years before it eventually becomes good, but I'm just still a bit of a naysayer.
I think that the Kinect actually is interesting here, because there are going to be, if VR has the same kind of success as the Kinect, and this is, it's going to be a stupid argument because I'm talking about basically a medium, a form of transmitting images versus a particular product. But anyway, let's go on with this. If VR is a success for a year, and one of these companies, be it Samsung, be it the Rift, be it the Vive, is a kind of Kinect level success, everyone is going to say, oh, VR failed again and VR is bad and so on. But I kind of see these things as being, maybe that's the sign of a good iteration on the way to something getting a foothold.
Well, I think I would say that a Kinect level performance would be a failure for VR at this point. I think the expectations are far higher from VR, and also people aren't looking for another good stepping stone on this eventual journey to VR arriving. I think people are looking for VR to arrive now.
Yeah, well, I've already said that I don't think that's going to happen. But I think that if a Kinect level success happens for one device, people will do this. They will instantly write it off. Whereas, in fact, that would be an enormous step forward for VR.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, I would love to see that happen with, say, Sony's VR solution. I guess that would be the most likely to look the most like Kinect. I mean, again, I want to go back to my previous point, which is that my main problem with Kinect is that it never had enough games to have any interesting games. It's all people dancing around on fake rugs driving down the Amazon or something. Like, and you don't get the really brilliant games like Boom Blocks on the Wii, where it's almost like a AA game where someone has like a really interesting design that uses the new input method in like quite an interesting way, but doesn't try and go massively over the top with it. And it's also like a decent game. Those are the things that I would really like to see. And Kinect, it feels to me like the vast majority of its catalogue is really, really commercial.
Steam Spy tweeted some interesting graphs recently. In these graphs, they demonstrate that some games are particularly likely to be the only game that the user owns. For example, there are a lot of Steam accounts that only own Dota 2 or CSGO. Ian Hoddingham, is it a coincidence that these games are particularly renowned for smurfing and cheating?
Yes, I do think that's a coincidence. I don't think that's anything to do with the underlying data here. This really is, as graphs go, a brilliantly interesting graph. It's incredibly stark, the number of Dawn of the Ancient 2 players, owners on Steam, for which that is pretty much their only game. The average number of games owned by a Dota 2 player is 12. The average number of games owned, this is on Steam, by a Rocket League player is 78. That's an absolutely huge difference. Now, a lot of that is to do with the fact that there are so many Dota 2 players that you kind of expect a bit of a skewed distribution. If you take... actually, I'm failing on the metaphor, so I'm going to abort it right now. But if we look at Counter-Strike Global Offensive, the average number of games owned by a player of CSGO is 40, which is also reasonably high. So it's not just about the number of players that Dota 2 has. I think it's really interesting. This is basically saying that this game is so good, so compelling, that you are bringing across people who are not really gamers outside of playing Dota 2.
I think that I'm going to just quickly return to the original premise of this and say that I think there probably is a significant number of people smurfing in these games. Because Dota is so massive, I actually think the number of solo accounts just for Dota is going to be statistically significant here. Because it's something that people want to do so much and the game's user base is so big. Are you really convinced that's not a part of this at all?
I just don't think it's statistically significant. I'm looking at this graph and, well, let me ask you a question. What percentage of Dota 2 Steam accounts do you think are Smurf accounts?
That's very difficult to know. I think that possibly over 20. Like, I think it could be a big chunk. I think smurfing in these games is massively common.
I think even if it was 40%, I think it wouldn't explain away like the really significant sort of quite massive results of this. I think looking at this data, I think that it would have to be a lot more than 40%, and I think that would surprise us both. Although, I mean, Dota 2 is free, and that's something that we should talk about. None of the other games that we're talking about here are free to play. So maybe this is just a huge number of foreign gamers who would never actually normally use Steam, who have just downloaded it to get Dota 2.
That's also very possible, actually, yeah. I mean, I think, so kind of returning to what you said, there is definitely some real market segmentation here. This is something that certainly indie developers have been talking about without data for a long time, that we assume that there are these people who kind of buy indie games in inverted commas, and there are people who buy sort of headline, very interesting indie games. So the Rocket League thing is really interesting because these are people who are general consumers of other games, whereas Dota is a phenomenon in its own right, and it kind of goes to the argument, the Dota MOBAs are not a genre argument, which I think is quite strong at the moment. So with this kind of data, it's good because we can start to segment and profile the different kinds of people who play games better and kind of understand what those people want a bit more.
We can. I'm gonna go some pretty heavy, hardcore maths on you now. I read a really interesting article this weekend about something called the inspection paradox. I'm just going to explain it really briefly. If you have a school and you have, say, a maths class in that school, and the school tells you that the average number of students in that class is 20, and then you ask every single student who's been in a maths class what is the average number of people in their classes, and they say 30, both of those things can be completely true, because the more people there are in a maths class, so say the number of people in any maths class ranges between, say, 10 and 40, the more people who are in one maths class, the more people who will report to you, the larger number. So if there are only one person in maths class, that's the only data point. So if you look at this in terms of how popular a game is, if a game has not got very many sales, it's likely to only be owned by people who generally like games, because those are the people who will buy the more obscure games. They're much more likely to have more games. Whereas if you take the most popular thing, that's going to be, almost by mathematical definition, owned by a lot of people who only own that and GTA 5 or something. So I would like to see some more data here about whether it really is just some kind of mathematical trend with how popular a game is.
Yes, your point is that it is necessarily true, and I think that's one of the other issues with some of the stuff Steam Spy have been putting out. For example, today, the graph that they tweeted about the median number of sales for games released sort of versus the total sales over time. But because it was over time, everything kind of trended towards zero because games sell less as they get older, and it wasn't all just based on first month. So
when you have a result that's as stark as this, I'm talking about the difference between your average Dota 2 owner having 12 other games in his Steam library and your average Torchlight 2 owner having 117. When it's like that stark, it's probably unlikely to be some interesting societal effect as it is to be like a real artifact of some underlying sort of distribution.
I think Steam Spy is definitely... I mean, it confused me earlier today with different axes that caused me to completely misinterpret a graph. So I think what we're seeing here is like, it's quite difficult for a lot of people to interpret this data well. And it's kind of... We're seeing a lot of scary information come out at the moment. And devs, I think, might be overreacting some of it for some of the reasons that, you're saying, that maybe there isn't a good generalized understanding of some of these mathematical ideas.
Yeah, I think you haven't just got to have the data. You've got to have quite a skilled statistical and business brain to really work out which of the data is really useful. And I think that he's not really got that yet. Like, it takes a decade for a really useful sports stat to be produced that actually works out where the meaningful data is, what's meaningful to throw away, and all that kind of thing. So it takes a long time to get like real meaning out of all this data.
Yeah, I mean, Steam Spy, I think he's doing great work in terms of collation, and it's now, as you say, people have to develop the mechanisms by which they understand the data. Daybreak Games are running an experiment with EverQuest 2. Players found to be cheating will have their characters moved to a special server shared with other cheaters and will no longer be eligible for support. Apparently this has been a long-standing request from their customer service staff. Producer Jimmy would like a special shout out to the RPS headline on this one, which is Steamfront Prison Experiment. Is this better than just banning cheaters, Ian Hardingham?
I think it probably is. This is such an interesting thing. This is a cool story, right? And I think that Second Life or something like it had this weird black and white tractor field realm that you were sent to for a short amount of time if you misbehaved. So this is not the first time this has happened, and also not the most sort of artistically interesting because it's just another server. But it's definitely a cool story. But I think beyond that, I'm trying to work out the kind of interesting moral stuff that this pushes out, because just as in real life, all crimes are not equal. All crimes are not equal in EverQuest 2, I don't think. So if you're just doing something relatively minor, I don't know what minor is in this world, and you get stuck in the Supermax prison of EverQuest 2 Prison Land, then you're going to be annoyed about that, and that's going to impact customer service tickets as well. What do you think?
I don't really get this, like, beyond a PR thing and a fun thing, both of those things it satisfies. It's fun and it's interesting. It doesn't seem to me better than banning, because I don't know what it means to have this server full of people who can't, who are cheaters and who can't get support. Like, I don't know what that means. Is it so that you can say your community numbers are higher, so you don't lose the banned people from your stats?
Well, I mean, banning someone is, I think, difficult in terms of you probably have to put a lot more due diligence to make sure the person actually did it, or that they did it too many times. And it's so much of a worse punishment to take away the functionality of a product that someone's paid for than it is to kind of say, well, actually, this is just another server, you're just with a specific subset of people. Yes, those happen to be other terrible people just like you who have performed crimes, but they can kind of sort of wave their hand and say that they haven't really taken anything away from the customer.
Yeah, I suppose that's a big part of it. I wonder what it's like to play on these servers. Like, do people reform, or do they just kind of become recidivist cheaters? Do they cheat more? Like, they try and out-cheat each other? It just sounds like, I don't know, I kind of don't know what the experience is, and I can't imagine it's good.
Yeah, exactly. You have to see whether there's any kind of reform there. I'm just wondering whether DayZ has a thing where if you behave yourself, you get sent off to a different server. Like, if you don't troll enough in DayZ, you get sent to the boring players server where you can just all act nice and not shoot each other.
Yeah, you have to actually do things with the zombies. It was the 20th anniversary of the Virtual Boy's North American release recently, and to celebrate, Fast Company wrote about the development of the console. Of particular note is that the Virtual Boy came out around the same time as a new and highly stringent product warning law. This led to Nintendo being overly cautious with warnings, which in Gunpei Yokei's estimation made the console seem dangerous. Ian Hardingham, does the Virtual Boy get a fair rap?
I think if your console makes the vast majority of people get headaches after using it for more than half an hour, you deserve your bad rap. I always love it when I hear people's explanations for the one reason their product didn't do well. It's not that I'm saying that I don't think it can be true. For instance, this warnings business, like, it could have had a big impact on it. Maybe there's a world in which the first version of Virtual Boy does much better, so they're able to iron out the hardware kinks. But I always love hearing people who haven't been that happy with the performance of their game or something else, or their music track or something, sort of saying the one big reason they think it didn't work. It's always a really interesting insight, and it leads you to question, is it ever one thing? It's usually a bunch of different things, and is that one thing like a massive overarching explanation, or is it, there are some people who'll tell you that something didn't work because they released 2 hours early on a Tuesday, or because China had a stock warning that week or something like that.
I think that thing is very much like your political beliefs or which operating system you use, in that it shows more about you than it does about the nature of the world itself. I think people are very bad at identifying individual factors as to why they fail. A lot of cases, they seem to be things that were just out of their control and that there was no way they could possibly have anticipated. So anything that falls neatly into those two categories is normally the one thing you say caused the problem that you had. And also, when you have a success, it's normally because you specifically did something very clever earlier than other people did. So yes, we're very bad at evaluating these things. Not only are we bad at doing it, for ourselves, we're also bad at doing it objectively. It's very hard to find out why things succeed or fail, especially in kind of entertainment trend-driven industries. I mean, yeah, I think the Virtual Boy probably deserves its negative press. I've never tried one. Also, this thing of having to interrupt gameplay every 15 minutes to tell you to take a break doesn't sound great. Imagine if free-to-play games had to do that. Yeah, I think that the Virtual Boy kind of... It is interesting to see this big article about it, about all the decisions, about all the technology. It's really worth reading this Fast Company article, because it's just seen as this sort of bad joke. And people often don't put it in the context of the good things about Nintendo and the good things about their strategy.
Yeah, I feel like I should play some of the games, because there are a couple on there. I think the Wario game on there is supposed to be quite good, but I don't have one, and it feels like... It doesn't feel like the kind of console you want to emulate, but there you go.
A former executive for Game of War developers Machine Zone has been arrested. Allegedly, he stole customer behaviour data in order to extort a larger severance package after being asked to leave the company. That's a hefty allegation. Should companies be doing more to protect their user data from this kind of thing?
I don't know how often this kind of thing happens. This is quite the story, because this employee, who I believe is of Chinese origin, he found out he was going to get fired and started stealing all of this crucial free-to-play data about when people pay money and lots of like important commercial facts. So then he used the fact he had this data to try and extort a larger severance package, as you said. Yes. And they said no.
Allegedly.
Yes, this is all alleged. And then he was arrested getting on a plane to China, which has led The Verge to suppose that possibly he was going to take that data and sell it to people in China, or maybe he was just going home. This is really sort of could be industrial espionage, but it also seems quite incompetent. These gigantic free-to-play games that are grossing just insane amounts per month terrify me, and I'm kind of the most interesting question to me is how valuable this data would be, because it's not people's email addresses, it's not their credit card details, it's kind of massive scale data of how humans respond to various different game and commercial stimuli, and I would like to know, how much of a step up that would give you.
Right, the value is exactly what I was going to focus on, because a lot of it's going to be proprietary, right? A lot of it's going to be like, well, we changed this picture of the sun to a slightly bigger, more yellow picture of the sun, and then 0.05% more people clicked on it. And generalizing that out of the context is something that I don't think a lot of companies can do. Maybe it's more vague than that. And it is so weird now that all of these games are just run on this kind of amazingly intense metrical analysis, and it is something that you can trade. You can't sort of steal someone's, I don't know, game design idea and then have that be incredibly valuable like this. It's just so weird that this market is so refined now.
Yeah, it's almost the most effective form of sort of testing of the human brain that can be going on right now, because there are tens of millions of people being involved, and as you imply, these companies are making very small changes to see how it changes people's emotions and how it changes their buying behavior. And it's all focused around trying to get people to play for longer and to pay more. But in some ways, this is the cutting edge of sort of personality investigation.
Right, I think also we're now kind of into this era where how much companies protect user data is going to be massively, massively significant. Someone said to me recently that if he was going to invest in a tech industry now, it would be security, because security is coming much more into the forefront, and you're starting to need these new methods, not only to protect from outside intrusion, but also from employee theft. So we're really trusting a lot of information. Again, although this is weird proprietary data, it's information about people that has been collected and entrusted to a company, and then what if that was all kind of made public or taken away? I don't know. Do you think these problems are solvable, or are we going to always persist in the system where there will be these security flaws and these big data leaks, whether they be credit cards or proprietary data?
I think we're working it out. A lot of people believe that data is born to be free, and that it's going to be the situation where it's impossible to keep anything secret. I recently read a very good science fiction book by sci-fi writing legend Vernor Vinge, I hope that's his name, which said that in the future it was impossible to secure data, but there were large freedom advocate corporations who went around obfuscating data as much as they could. So you wouldn't just have your Facebook profile. These companies would actually just have constantly running bots that would create weird fake versions of your Facebook profile. So it's very hard for other people to try and find out anything about you because it was all obfuscated. And that was interesting to me because I would have focused, before I read that, I would have focused on the answer to this question of, is cybersecurity possible? All of that. But then thinking about that, even if it's impossible to keep data under control, the idea of being able to obfuscate it is a completely different thing. So I think if I were to guess, I'd say that there will be privacy and it will be possible to keep data protected one way or the other. That's my guess, but I don't think we've worked it out yet.
I think one thing is that a lot of these companies don't start off at the scale where they eventually end up, so they don't plan to. So a lot of these games companies are startups, or they're small groups. I mean, thinking of Supercell, thinking of Rovio, like just kind of obvious examples. Even Zynga, they when they start off, they're just a kind of scrappy little operation. And at no point, they're sort of forced into the idea of security by virtue of their growth. It's like this kind of negative thing that you have to deal with, like insurance or filing your tax return. So I don't think we yet have kind of the best practices. And a lot of these companies, I bet, are not using good security practices at all. Basically because there's not really any incentive for them to do so, because losing a load of this data is just kind of slightly negative commercially for them. I mean, Ashley Madison recently, that has been in the news a lot, like losing all their data basically should be effectively the death knell for their service, but even they didn't seem to want to protect it in a particularly hardcore way.
Well, right now you've got all of these thousands and thousands of tiny companies running their own data collection schemes. We have a server that has a lot of people's data on, their email addresses, their usernames, and custom data like their record in our games. Maybe we're going to go to a future where you have a central place where your own data is kept, and you grant individual games companies, for instance, access to certain fields of your data, and they can store metadata on you, and that's not particularly interesting in the vast majority of cases, but then they have a token to access stuff like your email address, which would be private. Maybe that will be a lot easier to secure, so that in the future we don't really have to worry about, as you say, a company that's making tea towels having to run its own database of people's data.
Right. Yeah, generalizing that, and also sort of having more, I think legally you might, as you say, sort of be able to tell a company what they can and can't collect about you in a much more sort of simple way. I mean, we do have kind of legislation around that at the moment, but it's very sketchy, and the kind of service agreements that people offer don't really make that sensible to deal with. So eventually there'll probably be more pressure from the individual, and people will be more aware about these issues. Certainly younger people growing up with the current state of things online might be a bit more aware and a bit more willing to control their data.
Yeah.
Noticing that her non-gaming mother had started using gaming idioms in their conversations prompted Christina Zhu to write a piece for Boing Boing on how gaming is influencing Chinese slang. This is absolutely great, and you should go and read it. At the end of the article, she gives a list of her favourites, along with their direct translation and a rough idea of how they're used. We've got PK, meaning player killing, and that means to compete, which I really like. Another one of my favourites is blood trough is running empty, which means a feeling of being overwhelmed, and this comes from the groove in a knife that blood runs down, which was eventually adopted as the idiom for a life meter, and then translated into kind of an excess of emotion when responding to something cute, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Ian Hardingham, do we need to adopt more gaming slang?
We definitely do. I'm so unbelievably jealous of people living in China who can apparently go into a bar and tell the person at the bar that they are running an unauthorized plugin when showing disbelief in something. And yeah, as you say, blood trough is running empty is a fantastic one, and full blood resurrection being used just when someone's recovered from a hangover. So this is great. I kind of read this in slight disbelief, because these are really hardcore gaming terms that are supposedly completely in normal use now, and they're really, really fun.
I know. I think there's often a problem with these articles, particularly about Asian countries, about the ubiquity of this kind of thing. So there was the big myth in the StarCraft community that everyone in Korea watched StarCraft just because it was on TV. And it turned out that a load of kids watched it and it was on some really minor channel at night and most people hadn't heard of StarCraft. So it is difficult to know with this kind of piece. Like, if you really could walk in somewhere and say, oh, hey, let's go and play some live action Counter-Strike and go and play paintball. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I would like to believe that's true. But this is fantastic. I would definitely like to see. I mean, it's only the really terrible slang from gaming that makes it in. Like, maybe someone will know what owned means, I suppose. I mean, like, that's probably
yeah, it's at a very
too far.
basic level. I'm going to start using these with my wife this evening and see if she responds well, and maybe we can start this happening in England.
The one thing that most people recognise, and I think that's just because the phrase works, is if you carry 2 drinks and you go, oh, I'm dual wielding. Like, a lot of people will laugh. They might just be laughing at me when I say that.
No, that's a good one.
Than actually hit the joke. I say that far too much. Okay, that's enough of that, and now we move on to a slightly more relaxed portion of the show. So just take a deep breath, because we're going to enter the television and film lounge area, which, contrary to what I said, has kept its name from previous shows and may continue to do so. And this week we're going to look at a particular scene in the TV series The Mentalist. Now, I am catching up on The Mentalist. It's a pretty old show. If you haven't seen The Mentalist, then this will have spoilers, and also I'm only at season 4, so I can't deal in spoilers subsequently. That's going to make this conversation quite interesting. So, in The Mentalist, there is an overarching plot arc about a serial killer called Red John, and the protagonist of The Mentalist is basically Derren Brown meets Sherlock Holmes. He can deduce anything about anyone by sort of looking at them, and he can manipulate them with a lot of mind tricks. And Red John is his foil. He's killed his wife and child. He's the terrible bad guy. And finally, at the end of this season, there's a plot about a mole that he has in the investigative organisation, and you finally get to meet him. And there's a scene in a shopping mall where a lot of things play out, and eventually the camera reveals that the one sinister mastermind lurking at a table is played by Bradley Whitford. Now, this is possibly one of my new favourite scenes in TV, Ian Hardingham. I believe you're also a fan of this scene.
I'm a massive fan of this scene, but I'm probably about to ruin your day. Yeah. Because this is one of the most tragic, genuinely tragic things in fandom I've ever experienced. It is so unbelievably rare for a show with an overarching plotline such as this has to actually execute it being wrapped up well. This is the 3rd season that you've just watched, and the 3rd season is great, and it's much more closely linked to him trying to find Red John than the previous 2 series. A lot more of the series is about that, and a lot less about procedural stuff. And you just know that they're going to take it away from you at the last moment. There's no way they're actually going to have him kill the big bad guy in series 3, and they've done it before, and it would just be so annoying. And it looks like it's being set up perfectly for that to happen in the final episode of series 3. And it turns out that he actually has a confrontation with Red John. And not only is Red John played by Bradley Whitford, who is fantastic as it.
Yes.
Totally believable. And there's a massive twist where he actually, the main character, shoots and kills Red John. And it's brilliant. And in my heart, there are only 3 series of The Mentalist, and this is just the best ending to this kind of thing that has ever been. Unfortunately, they walk it back in the next series, and they pretend that this wasn't Red John. This was one of his lieutenants, which is made me very, very sad, Paul Taylor.
I know, it's a real problem, because it only works because they've built this character up so much, and it is him, and then it's Bradley Whitford, who he's wonderful, because whatever part he plays, he seems to have this slight just this like tinge of hamminess and irony to it, just this slight awareness. So if you want, I mean, it's why he's so great in Cabin in the Woods, which I think is probably his best ever performance. If you want an actor that just will tinge something, then Bradley Whitford is great. And some of the delivery of his lines in this bit, he has some quite generic sort of evil serial killer lines, and he really he puts in unnecessary pauses, he does funny little expressions. He's so good. So yes, when in the first episode of the next series it turns out it wasn't really him, it was someone else, and you know that they're just going to play out the stupid plot for all time, it really does undermine it. And I think what would have been so good is if they'd contrived a reason for it to actually be Bradley Whitford, but then he manages to get away through some clever thing that he's done, and you just don't see him again for like another 2 seasons. I think you could change the Red John dynamic by having it, you know who he is, you've seen his face, but maybe he just can't be found again, and he pops up in these weird situations, and there's some debate as to whether it was really him, rather than this dumb, like, you killed Bradley Whitford, you can't bring him back now. So
I think it would undermine it for me if he wasn't actually dead, because one of the greatest things about this is that there is no compromise. This is for the majority, for the time between the end of series 3 and the beginning of series 4. There's real catharsis. This is actually the end. He hasn't just sort of escaped in some silly way. What is really also terrible about this is that the show kind of continues and still is actually quite good for the next 2 seasons. And then he actually confronts and kills Red John at the end of the 5th season, and it's very, very underwhelming compared to this brilliant scene. And then after that, they keep going in a new world where Red John is no longer in it. So if they'd just done that at the end of series 3, then it could have been so perfect. Now, it's also true that series, I think it's 6, is pretty terrible. So I don't know if they've changed showrunners, but I kind of like cry a tear for this every month or so, because this was so good for a while.
I think there's definitely a slight implication throughout season 3 that they had a point where they could pivot to actually ending it. So I'm not sure if it was one of those things where they had the option open to end the show with a particular plot
definitely.
line,
if they weren't going to get re-signed.
And
that would have been great, and that makes me like it more. I want to live in the world where in some ways it got cancelled after that season, so we could just have a perfect ending.
Well, we can believe that. It's a final note on this. It's just the way that there's a couple of Whitford moments. He delivers the line "okay" when the mentalist character says something pithy to him. He says "okay," but he looks so bored. He looks really tired. He rolls his eyes. He goes, "Okay." And it's just the mark of a great bad guy actor to take these very banal lines, to seem bored with being a bad guy, to seem like the protagonist is really trivial and irritating, I think is fantastic. So if you want your masterpiece acting class, then watch this. And
also, Red John throughout the show until Bradley Whitford appears always has a slight campness about him. Which I don't actually think is particularly natural for Bradley Whitford, or not this particular kind of campness, and he pulls that off brilliantly as well. Whereas the supposed real Red John at the end of series 5 just sort of puts on this horrible acting performance in those terms that isn't anything like his character in the rest of the show. So we are big members of the Bradley Whitford fan club.
We are. I think one thing that The Mentalist does well is that the main character is completely ludicrous. As I said, he's this kind of unbelievable character, and they do the best job they can of making it seem plausible that he could be a real person. And that's the same with Bradley Whitford's performance. This is the guy who he manipulates everyone. He probably manipulates the president at some point. Like, he's able to control everyone. And if you kind of imagine what that sort of person might be like, the way he plays the character does seem to sort of tally up to that. So good stuff. Right, that's enough of that. And now it's time for another recurring feature, which is Ian's Magic Corner, where we look at design developments in Magic the Gathering. So this week you're going to talk about the Magic's head of design, his regular blog post about the state of Magic design.
Yeah, so this is fantastic. I didn't know that Mark Rosewater, as you say, the head of design for Magic the Gathering, does a big wrap-up column every year on how that year's Magic cards basically have gone, the sets and the block that have come out that year, and it goes into great detail, and it talks a lot about his point of view about what things work and what things don't. It's slightly over positive. It's definitely like slightly corporatized, but he definitely talks about stuff that doesn't work. And getting this kind of access, I think, is just another example of how Wizards of the Coast are really killing it with what they're doing, basically. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of the mechanics that they brought in this year, and because that's mainly what we've been talking about, is a kind of like a way of putting a microscope on some game design by just looking at individual Magic cards. So I want to talk about a mechanic called Manifest, which is a version of a mechanic called Morph, and I think you'll like this. Morph seems to me to be an over complicated card, which basically allows you to cast it face down as a 2/2 creature, which you can then cast for its sort of cost at some later point from the table. So the idea being that you can hide from your opponent what this card actually is. It's sort of masquerading as some sort of boring low-level creature, and then play it at some point later. The reason why I think that's a little bit overcomplicated and slightly boring is that I'm not sort of sure why it's that much different from just playing a card from your hands. Like, it doesn't seem that much sort of new or interesting. But there's this new mechanic that they introduced this year called Manifest, which basically allows you to do this, but for cards from the top of your deck. So you play a different card that has Manifest, and it allows you to put usually 1 or 2 cards from the very top of your deck face down onto the battlefield, and they are a 2/2 creature at that point. Now, you are allowed to look at what these cards are, and if they are a creature card at some point, you can then cast them from the table. But the whole interesting thing is that you don't know what those cards are until they are put on the table. Your opponent has no idea what they are. And that's just an example of both a really cool mechanic and just how completely insane Magic the Gathering is.
Absolutely. That does make a lot of sense, actually. Like, again, it's this thing of adding to the manipulation of information at any time what you know and what your opponent doesn't know. That kind of increases skill in these games. And you're right, you can only get this in the kind of absolutely bonkers system that is Magic. And I do wonder about, like, they take some quite big risks with their design. I think they've got to a point where they feel comfortable about throwing in these changes and just letting the community work stuff out. And the community knows that sort of by the next release, they can kind of patch all of this stuff out, or they can change the tournament rules and change the bans and
well,
so
because
on
the cards are only legal in Standard for 2 years, it does really allow them to be really creative. But you're right, they are absolutely, I think, almost fearless with it. Like, they really go to some crazy places.
So one of the things I liked about this was he started talking about dragons, and there was this big release centered around dragons. And it's so funny, they have sort of really particular things that are kind of germane to all game design, which is that they wanted this kind of aesthetic narrative thing with the dragons, and it precluded them having baby dragons because that didn't work in the story. And the designer was saying, I had these great ideas for baby dragons, and with retrospect, I should have agitated to get the baby dragons in there so that I could do my design things. I just thought, wow, that just sounds exactly like video game development to me.
Yeah, totally. In fact, the whole thing about this dragon set, I'll talk about a bit more about it now, is actually much more of a sort of a general design thing than a specifically Magic design thing. It turns out that they kind of misunderstood how dragons were perceived as a concept. So their original starting position were that dragons are awesome, everyone loves dragons. And it turns out that some people don't like dragons. And actually, interestingly, he's blaming the blowback against dragons on the idea that some people viewed older dragon cards as being a certain kind of boring playstyle, basically. And I actually think he's kind of explaining it away in some of the ways we were talking about a bit earlier. I think that maybe some people just don't like dragons, full stop.
Right, that's true. Yeah, I think there's probably both the narrative aesthetic reaction to dragons, and also this. It's amazing that they kind of tagged this with this concept of these cards that people didn't like. But yeah, no, this was really interesting, and it would be good to see more developers of these ongoing games. Like, I'd like to see, the DayZ developers, maybe League of Legends. I think they do this a bit more. They're quite good with their community, but it's really nice to see the ongoing design thoughts. But you need to be ready to have a lot of honesty, and you need to have a good dialogue with your community, I think, to be able to do this. Like, a lot of communities will read this kind of thing and go, but why didn't you put in the one thing I wanted? And I don't know if there's as much of that in Magic as there is in other things.
Yeah, to finish this off, something that I was very surprised by this article was how much they focus on the narrative elements. Even as a sort of vaguely casual Magic player, I really enjoy the cards and the art on the cards and the vague idea of the narrative behind it. But a lot of his post-mortem of this year was based around how some elements of the narrative were left, how it wasn't quite sort of worked through properly, and they really care, a lot more about that than I would have thought he would.
Indeed. And now it's time for the games that were released this week in 2005, thanks to Eurogamer. So, Ian Hardingham, would you like to run us through those?
I would. Hello. This feature is still very much on probation and could die any week. So enjoy it while it lasts, and send in Twitter tweets if you want it to stay alive, because it might not. So yes, 26th of August 2005, on the PC we had Beyond Blitzkrieg and the Blitzkrieg Anthology. We also had Sacred Gold, which I think is the gold version of a game called Sacred, rather than a game about Sacred Gold. And on the consoles, we had 187 Ride or Die. I think I had a game on the Game Boy called Ride or Die. Super Monkey Ball Deluxe, which was like way after Super Monkey Ball jumped the shark and became really boring and commercial and cynical. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon 2: Summit Strike. This was when Tom Clancy was still with us. Ghost Recon was a pretty cool game. And Outlaw Tennis, which I'm going to look up after this podcast and try and play, I think.
Yes, indeed. So there's a bunch of things in this that are interesting. We finally hit a week where we've got good games, because Sacred, as you point out, is the gold edition of Sacred, which is available now on Good Old Games. They're not a sponsor. I don't know why I said that, but this is actually a good RPG. So we had some really bad months. I think we're hitting the end of the summer drought now. Also, Blitzkrieg Anthology is an RTS, which is kind of quite well regarded, and is available on Steam as well. What I couldn't figure out in the short amount of time that I've been Googling things as you were talking was what Beyond Blitzkrieg actually is. It may not be related to the Blitzkrieg Anthology. It may in fact be, this might be the greatest coincidence of game releases of all time.
That would be quite a coincidence.
It would. The company that made Beyond Blitzkrieg are probably kicking themselves that they're not remembered in the annals of history, coming up against the Anthology. Such a bad week to release on PC. You missed out on the PS2. We had Wild Water Adrenaline.
Yes, I did miss that out, and I also missed out Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2, which really sounds like an exceptionally boring member of the Resident Evil canon.
That was the real tragedy of this section. Are we done? Should we move on?
Well, I've just googled Wild Water Adrenaline, and it looks fairly boring. We should have a bet every week, and whoever loses the bet has to play one of these games.
Oh wow, we should definitely do that. Right, on to the current day now, and it's time to run through the top 10 UK Steam games. Number 10, Mad Max on pre-order. Number 9, Universe Sandbox 2 in early access. Number 8 is Ark Survival Evolved. Number 7 is COD Black Ops 3 on pre-order. Number 6 is GTA 5. Number 5 is Rocket League. Number 4 is CSGO. Number 3 is Pillars of Eternity, The White March Part 1. Number 2 is Pillars of Eternity, which is 33% off. And number 1 is Metal Gear Solid 5 pre-order. It's the week of the pre-orders and the early access. I mean, this is getting ridiculous now. I suppose it's always been thus with Steam.
Yeah, listing these every week certainly brings home some aspects of the Steam ecosystem. I am very excited for Metal Gear Solid 5. I played Ground Zeroes on the PlayStation 4 this weekend, and I really enjoyed it. And I read a kind of initial review thing on Eurogamer, and it sounds great. It actually sounds a little bit like Mercenaries, Jagged Alliance 2, in that
really
there are things that can happen that just impact everything. Like there's this side mission where you can rescue some Japanese person, and only if you rescue this person can you translate like vast amounts of like the people's testimonies in the game, and sort of actually interrogate them. And apparently there's a lot of stuff like that, and it just sounds, to be honest, absolutely brilliant. So I might pre-order that.
That's incredible. Do you think I'd like Ground Zeroes if I played it?
I mean, the problem is that it's still got that amazing thing Metal Gear Solid has always had, where it's this combination of really good stuff with kind of sort of almost... It almost bathes in clunkiness and weirdness. In fact, it does bathe in that. Like that's what it wants. You almost certainly won't like the completely over-the-top action aesthetic as much as me. Like I really like that, and you may just find that very grating. The gameplay's good, but what's so interesting about Ground Zeroes is that it's this one area, but there are so many things to find out about it, and you can approach it in any different way. I think there's a chance that MGS5 could just be like properly great, and I want to try to sort of get into it properly and to give it a real go.
Okay, interesting stuff. Right, that's the end of that. Now it's on to your reader questions. And we're going to start with Owen Farrell, who says he's got 3 questions, which is ridiculous. The first question is, do you have a reminder set on your phone to remind you to tweet "May the whatever be with you," or as I call it, "Day the date be with you"? If you follow me on Twitter, I tweet the date every day in the same format. And the answer to that question is no, I don't have a reminder set on my phone. It comes out of a natural, organic inspiration every day. I remember to do it, and it's part of my connection with both my journey through time and my Twitter audience. And he says, what games are you currently playing, and what are your thoughts? Well, I'm still playing pretty much just Smash Brothers and Rocket League. And I like both of those games. I think we've covered them more than enough on the podcast. You just mentioned Ground Zeroes. Are you playing anything else?
Yeah, I'm playing that and Rocket League, and I'm going to start playing Satellite Rain. I read a review. I think it came out properly this week. And while the review was slightly lukewarm, some aspects of it look really interesting. The fact that it's sort of a completely explorable open world Syndicate, it actually reminded me a lot of Syndicate Wars, and I have a huge amount of nostalgia for Syndicate Wars, especially the thing where you would turn up to a level and you weren't wanted in any way yet. You hadn't got into any combat, and you could kind of just walk around this building that you were gonna go into, and it had all these armed guards, and this feeling of what was about to happen was really exciting. And apparently they've got that in Satellite Rain as well. So I'm definitely going to get that and play that the next chance I get.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes, I did back that on Kickstarter. It's one of my only backed games. So I'm pleased that it came out and is sort of reasonably good. So I will pick up my Steam key for that. Owen Farrell also says, can you pretend I didn't put that last question in quotation marks as I'm a complete twat? And the answer is no. Bodies07 says, why did you opt not to release Frozen Cortex on console, something you would consider for future titles? Well, we don't generally do our own console versions of games, mostly because the engine we use is not very portable, and also it's quite difficult. We want to focus on kind of the development of the original game stuff. Frozen Cortex on console is something that we've thought about. If the right situation arose, then we would do that. Future titles we'll definitely consider on consoles. I think that's the end of that, unless you want to add anything.
No, I fully sponsor your answer to that question.
Excellent. Well, in that case, that's the end of the show. Thank you very much for joining us. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm Mode7Games, and he's Ian Hardingham. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.